Welcome to the Geopolitical Pickle. Today with us, we're going to have Professor Hussein Solomon. He's the head of the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Free State. And we're going to be talking about diverse topics from Islamism in Africa to political Islam, territoriality of Islamic groups, different topics as soon as the conversation goes. But first of all, I would like to thank you very much, Professor Solomon, for being here with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
It is a pleasure to have you here. And I would like to ask you, the first question is going to be a little bit general, but I would like to ask you for your impression in what is the current situation of jihadi groups in Africa, especially, with everything that's going on in the world right now. What is the situation of jihadi groups in Africa?
Well, I think that they are growing. I think if you look at the sophistication of the attacks, for example, in the Hayat Hotel in terms of the Somali capital, if you look at what's happening in terms of how Al-Shabaab is exploiting the situation in terms of the rebellion, in terms of northern Ethiopia, if you look at the coming together of the various Al-Qaeda related groups in terms of JNIM, in terms of the Sahel, if you look at the fact that half of all of the global attacks of IS is linked to the various affiliates on the African continent, it's certainly growing. I think there's a couple of other issues which we need to bear in mind, which is fueling this. I think obviously the African state doesn't have the capability of dealing with this. You have French forces now withdrawing. You will have the Americans, I'm not quite sure, because I think that the war in Ukraine is sucking up their attention and so forth. But I also think that domestic instability in the forms of the various coups in West Africa has also given them more scope. So definitely it's expanding, it's more lethal. And I'm sorry to say this, but the African Union is missing in action.
So we look at just the last few days, for example, I think there's been attacks in Burkina Faso, in Somalia, where there's been a lot of casualties. So I really think, as you say, it's been expanding. And I know you've said before about how this is basically because of a deficiency of the state functionality in these territories. Can you expand on that a bit for us?
Well, look, in many of these states, people are appointed in senior levels of the security apparatus, first and foremost, on the basis of who they know as opposed to what they know. And they're generally loyal to the incumbent. So, for example, many African states make use of anti-terror legislation against pro-democracy activists. So their focus is really in terms of political opposition, often legitimate democratic opposition to their rule, as opposed to these insurgents. The other thing, of course, is the African militaries are not really trained to fight counterinsurgency campaigns. They tend to be top-heavy, they tend to be cumbersome, their military doctrine is off base, the kind of weapons that they put out in terms of feel, in terms of their tactics, in terms of their strategy, all of these things are problematic. And of course, there's been various European armies which have been trying to assist them, and of course, the Americans. But, an African military is not the same as its European or American counterpart. But I also think that many of these insurgencies have their basis in socioeconomic circumstances, in terms of local circumstances, as well as feeling of political marginalization. There's also often an ethnic dimension to this, right? So if you take Somalia's Al-Shabaab, 80% of the fighters of Al-Shabaab come out of one particular clan, the Rahanweyn, okay? And if you take the issue of Boko Haram, it is Kanuri and to a certain extent also Hausa Fulani, ethnocentric nationalism. If you take many of the groups in terms of the Sahel, especially in terms of northern Mali, They are linked to Tuareg nationalism and the search for an Azawad homeland going back hundreds of years. The post-colonial African state has dismally failed in terms of good governance, in terms of the provision of public goods, and so on. And this set the basis for these various groups to mobilize against the state, and then linking up with your Al-Qaeda Central, if you want to call it, your IS Central, if you wish to call it. But I also blame various foreign powers, because they've been largely supportive of the status quo, of the political incumbents, as opposed to trying to also opening up the democratic political space, opening up and supporting more moderate forms of Islam. And I also think that for a long time, for various reasons, people have turned a blind eye to various supportive measures taken by, for example, Gulf countries in terms of the ideology, in terms of the funding, in terms of radical sermons coming through, and so forth. Okay. Mm-hmm. And it's become a toxic mix, which I hope that we can escape from.
I would like to ask you, because you were mentioning about you've been talking about the socioeconomic backgrounds that we need to analyze in this sense. We've been talking about the role of the state. How has the COVID pandemic affected the development of these jihadi groups? Particularly, for example, where places in certain states where the state could not reach in providing any sort of health assistance or whatever. How has this affected the action and also the territoriality of jihadi groups in Africa?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is if you look at the UN, they actually don't have an opinion on this. If you look at the counterterrorism directorate and so on, they said it's too early to tell. Basically, in terms of what happened with COVID, was certainly public spaces was closed down, movement was closed down, and to a certain extent there was a lull in jihadi activities. But the closing down of now public spaces and so on was also counterproductive, because it also prevented things like de-radicalization networks, NGOs working in terms of that. The other side of the coin, of course, is that given the poverty of now much of the African populations, the closure of now space, the restrictions on movement, resulted in those socioeconomic conditions to deteriorate, which many of the jihadi groups then made use in terms of their propaganda. Okay, and when we talk about these jihadi groups, we must also accept the fact that they also play a role in doing some socioeconomic outreach in terms of providing rudimentary healthcare, in terms of schooling, but of course you are talking about religious indoctrination and stuff like that. You are talking about them providing some assistance, and thereby actually people's allegiance moves from the state to these groupings, to these non-state actors. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's the reason why I felt that despite the rhetoric coming out of Washington, Paris, Brussels, London, and so on, about holistic counterterrorism strategies, it's still very much military dominant. And they're not also putting emphasis on those things which are driving these people to terrorism. Even if you look at this amazing work that the United Nations Development Program has done, Journeys to Extremism, pointing out issues of poverty, issues of governance, the fact that counterterrorism operations which do not make a distinction between civilians and terrorist insurgents are actually resulting in more people joining the jihadi groups. But the same kind of thing came out of the counterterrorism or the terrorism index and so forth. But for some reason, the emphasis is still on just the military dimension, and not enough is being put into those other dimensions.
I mean, that's interesting, because if we look at the West, basically has been so much money spent in West Africa and there's been very little results to show for it. And what you're saying basically is that all that money was spent on military intervention, but really there's underlying issues, and predominantly, I guess, local issues in each country which need to be addressed to fix the root cause of the problem.
Even, for example, the latest EU mission in Mali, which was intended to change from a more militaristic perspective of the late Operation Serval and everything into a more encompassing one. There's arguments that it's indeed still a military intervention in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, you talk about Mali, and you know that the military junta which came to power has now prevented the operation from taking place. But I also think, when we are talking about specifically the Sahel, let's be honest about it. I mean, you're talking about 20 years, more than 20 years in some cases, of the involvement of external powers, notably Washington and Paris, in the Sahel. And you're right. I mean, they haven't been able to quell this because they haven't been able to deal with the problematic of the state itself, which is fundamentally exclusionary. If you, and there is something else which is very different from, let's say, terrorism in terms of Europe or the Americas and so on. And that is that, in terms of your Hollywood movies, there is very, very clearly a bad guy and a good guy. In terms of the African landscape, it's gray. Okay, there are different shades of gray, but it's gray. So what do I mean by that? If you take Boko Haram, there were some senior politicians who who were providing support to Boko Haram for their own reasons. They were President Goodluck Jonathan, the former president of Nigeria, actually brought in private military contractors because he couldn't trust his armed forces because these were, according to him, penetrated. And he felt it goes into his own party, into the judiciary, and so on. In the case of Somalia, you have there armament shipments which were destined for the Somali federal government and its armed forces suddenly wound its way into Al-Shabaab hands. So somebody inside is selling those weapons. In the case of Mali, you had previous governments who were involved with narco trafficking with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So it's a very difficult landscape to know who the good guys are and who are the bad guys are. So you say, well, you are capacity building and you are doing all of these things, right? You are putting people onto military exercises, right? And training. And then they come back and they stage military coups.
Yeah.
Did you miss out civil military relations?
There was some link missing there. Yeah.
But whatever it is, it's a mess. But more importantly, I would say to you that as someone who's an African and who identifies as an African, who lives on the African continent, I think for me, the fact that the African security architecture in the form of the African Union, in the form of the regional economic communities, is simply not working, right? So, for example, the Sahel G5 doesn't exist in terms of the AU architecture. But we know how it was created. in my view, largely as a result of the French creation, ostensibly to act as a force multiplier for Operation Barkhane troops. But within the AU architecture, it doesn't exist. If you take AMISOM, which has been going on and on and on, AMISOM doesn't really exist in terms of that structure, and the continental rapid response capabilities just doesn't exist. And I'm not quite sure how you fix this.
Just on that, do you think it would be more beneficial for, say, the non-African actors that are trying to put money into the situation to actually work in promoting solutions within the African Union, say getting a force developed locally there that can address these issues as a counter to what has been done previously, which is deploy French forces, say, or American forces in training local troops and things like that?
Well, here's the problem. The AU is dysfunctional. Okay, and the AU is not a super state. It's an interstate structure. And the dysfunctional African state is reflected in dysfunctional ECOWAS, SADC, IGAD, whatever, and it's also represented in a dysfunctional African Union. So putting money into dysfunctional African Union, I mean, you know that they were supposed to have a rapid response force of 3,000 in each of the regions, because the RECs, as in the regional economic communities, but I would argue it's actually a REC, as in WRECK, was I mean, and then they said it is fully operational and stuff. And every time there's a crisis, you know, AMISOM is an extra regional force. You know, it's not from the East African community and stuff like that. The Sahel G5 is not related to ECOWAS and ECOMOG structures, right? So even in terms of Mozambique, in terms of SADC, it's Rwanda and so on. So what you have is a mess. And, you know, somewhat more controversially, you know, some people have actually argued that following the Doha round of talks in which, you know, the Taliban has now taken control of Afghanistan, people should look at negotiating with the likes of Al-Shabaab, with Boko Haram, and so on. And I don't think that they actually understand how these jihadi groups actually operate, right? Because if you take the Taliban, now that they have control, they've actually reneged on the agreements, on various agreements, but more importantly, any moderation of the Taliban has resulted in a more extreme Islamic state in Khorasan there. So similarly on the African continent, these jihadi groups, you can say, well, let's make a deal with the Kanuri nationalists in Boko Haram and separate them from the more militant IS elements. Let's make a deal with the Rahan Wayne clan elders and thereby bypass Al-Shabaab. But the groups are quite fragmented. So an emir, if I want to use that terminology, of a local African jihadi group does not have command and control over his over those groups who have taken a bayat or an oath of allegiance towards him. Okay, they often push local agendas and use the regional grouping occasionally and so on. And sometimes they fight, for example, in terms of cigarette smuggling or whatever counterfeit they are using to fund their operations. This is what's happening. The other thing is, as you know, these groups are often in competition with each other. So you have Boko Haram proper, and then you have Islamic State Wilayat, right? Because there was a leadership tussle inside Boko Haram proper. And that's problematic. And of course, you have a problem where you have weak states now cannot enforce saying, you know, thou shalt not kill, which is the basic building block of security. And and I think it's undermining states who are already fragile. If you take, the basic definition of a state in terms of having the monopoly over coercive force over its territory. What you find then is the state's power is actually decreasing and decreasing. And I think the war in Ukraine is causing that more so. How? Well, obviously resources are being moved, right? Towards Europe and so forth, right? By these external players. But then you also have another problem. And that other problem relates to the price of wheat, fuel, inflation. Many African countries get their wheat from Ukraine, right? And Russia. The cost of fertilizers, right, has now gone up by 300%, resulting in a further 20% reduction in terms of farmers being able to get more crop out of their land. So on the one hand, you are not getting those imports, but at the same time, your own food basis, and I won't even talk about climate change and desertification and so on. And the state's inability to provide to its people is coming to the fore, which is being capitalized upon by these jihadi groups.
And in that sense, can they actually pose an alternative to the state? Can any
a legitimate alternative?
Not a legitimate, but more of a viable alternative? Does any group currently have the capacity of sustaining a pseudo state apparatus that could, for example, provide some basic goods
similar to Taliban?
Similar to Taliban, or similar to how Islamic State was at one point in northern Syria and in Iraq?
Well, I mean, what I find interesting in terms of, there are certain areas, okay, like the Sambisa forest, which is a no-go zone. The Nigerians in early September this month have launched an operation there in terms of special forces and stuff like that. But this is a vast terrain. And essentially what the insurgents do is they just move around that terrain, okay? And the state is unable to, they clear out a particular area and they move into another area. I mean, if you take the Sahel, right, also, there are areas where it is no-go zones, and the power of the state is actually contracting. In terms of Somalia, when you look at that attack in terms of the Hayat, I mean, look at the sophistication, look at the planning, look at the fact that they managed to stay in control of the hotel for 30 hours.
Yeah.
30 hours. This is Mogadishu. This is supposedly the capital of Somalia, right? If you, in terms of Mozambique, when they occupied that coastal town, that's Islamic State there. When you are talking about northern parts of Mali, Gao, Kidal, Timbuktu, I think all of those areas is actually beyond the reach of the state. Now there's rival groups there and so on and so forth, but they're effectively outside the control of the state, and the state has been unable to do it. Partly, if you take Mali, is because there's been 4 Tuareg rebellions, as you know, since the state of Mali came into being, and each time the state would try to co-opt local elites in terms of power sharing, as opposed to really engaging in sort of inclusive governance and sharing and so forth. So, for example, if you take, in terms of southern Mali, you are talking about 63% poverty rates. But when you talk about northern Mali, if you take Kidal, you're talking about 92% poverty rates. If you take Nigeria, which is also split north-south in terms of Christian-Muslim, right? There you are talking about a 72% poverty rate in terms of northern Nigeria, right? And as opposed to southern Nigeria, which is more developed, the industrial heartland, and so on. The same kind of dynamic in terms of Mozambique, right, with Cabo Delgado being the most impoverished area. All of these dynamics matter in terms of the state contracting, and just its capacity, its lack of leadership, the levels of corruption inside the state, and in my view, no matter how much of a military force what you put in there, it's unable to quell what's happening. I mean, AMISOM is minuscule compared to, let's say, the army of Siad Barre, right? Not that he was a nice guy or now anything like that. If you take the Sahel G5 force, it's minuscule. If you look at the territory of the Sahel, if you not only the size but the terrain, and how difficult it is to control all of that territory, to have an eye on all of that territory when you put in forces to supply those forces and keep them supplied and not having the supply lines crushed and so forth. It's a logistical nightmare, and unfortunately, it's one that was entirely predictable in my view.
I would like to go a little bit. Well, we would like to go a little bit into Somalia. You've written wide about it, and we would like to ask you about the current situation. Basically, how is Al-Shabaab? Well, how is Al-Shabaab right now established? We've been mentioning before the terrorist attacks and the hostage situation. Well, the hotel seizure in Mogadishu,
in the capital,
and also some important
regional aspects.
Something important happened during last year in neighboring Ethiopia. How is Al-Shabaab right now developing, and what is its situation in the terrain?
And any impacts that the Tigray situation might have had in developing there?
Yeah. Look, I think that Al-Shabaab, obviously I mentioned the Hayat attack in terms of the hotel.
Yes.
But I think that there's clear signs of fatigue in terms of AMISOM and in terms of Western donors, let's be honest. Without those donors, AMISOM will cease to exist. In the case of the Somali government, I mean, the infighting and so on, they are still quite weak and they're unable, in my view, to control the state without AMISOM. I think that if you talk about what's happening in terms of Tigray, I think in July this year, as you know, there's been the Ethiopian forces are battling this the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front up north. And what was interesting about Al-Shabaab was how sophisticated they had operated. They first attacked some border towns, which on the Somali-Ethiopia border, which were actually controlled by the Ethiopian Liu police force. And this was a diversionary attack, it seems. And they sent a much larger force of 500 into Ethiopia, and they had penetrated 100 kilometers into Ethiopian territory. Now, the Ethiopians say that they've neutralized the force and so on. But for Al-Shabaab to have actually done this, first of all, they've always I mean, the war between Abyssinia and various Somali groups, has
been
have a long
ongoing.
history.
Exactly.
Yes.
Like 500-600
This comes from
years,
afar.
right?
Yes.
And and let's not forget the Somali five-pointed flag, and I think part of the reason why Ethiopia was there was trying to protect their own assets in terms of the Ogaden, which is Somali. And so Al-Shabaab is Islamist, but they're also nationalist.
Yeah.
They also have an issue with parts of their territory, which has been included in terms of Kenya as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the attacks there. And they've always wanted to strike at Ethiopia. And there have been various attempts, an attack on a soccer match in terms of 2014, various attempts to attack Ethiopia have been foiled and so on. But what was very interesting was I think they understood that the Ethiopian forces was largely preoccupied with what's happening in terms of Tigray. And so they exploited that and they entered there. And some media reports say that this, while there was a force of 500, 100 of them is still involved. Is still involved there, and I think that shows the weakness of the Ethiopian state, and the fact that Al-Shabaab strategically could read into this an opportunity to exploit their preoccupation with the North and moving in a force. But it also, I think, shows to me that if you take the countries around it, I mean, Kenya has just had a rather fractious election.
Yes.
William Ruto is the president. Raila Odinga contests that. He lost at the courts, but, there's still issues there. I don't think Kenyan Somalis have been integrated into Kenyan society. I went on a research trip to Kenya and I spoke to Kenyan Somalis who have difficulty accessing things like identity documents, even though they've been born there and so on. And again, it goes and speaks to the issue of the need for more inclusionary citizenship. I think in terms of Ethiopia, there's a lot of fractures happening there. And Ethiopia now, here you have the Prime Minister, winning the Nobel Prize and and stuff. And suddenly things are going pear-shaped.
An interesting 2-year period of time. That's, we could call it like that.
And so this raises an interesting question. If Al-Shabaab has read the situation in Ethiopia like this, can it also exploit the weaknesses in neighboring areas to move forward, especially given the fatigue in terms of forces like AMISOM and so on? And when you think of AMISOM, right, and for example, if you think of countries like Uganda being part of AMISOM, and if you look at President Museveni's very warm welcome to Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and the fact that the Ugandans have a problem with the fact that the West has cooled about Museveni and about him being a reformer, and the fact that he's been in power for so long, and their perceived support of Bobi Wine and so on. Will the Ugandans, for example, continue to be part of AMISOM, right? And so forth. So there's a lot of variables out there, which I think, frankly, is in Al-Shabaab's favor.
Just to wrap up for this first section of the interview, do you think that this is kind of indicative of Islamic groups across Africa as a whole, because I see it kind of as an opportunistic situation where there's been the focus of the central government directed elsewhere to a rebellion in the north, and then that's when a lot of the Shabab movement has been coming into Ethiopia once again. And that's just one instance of the Islamic group, but I think it can be extrapolated widely across the whole continent to the different.
Even, for example, since we were talking about Mali a lot,
just to tie it back to the different spaces.
Problems within the government in Mali that leads to a coup, that leads to a reinforcement of, for example, the ties between Islamic groups in northern Mali with Tuareg families because of being overlooked.
Absolutely. Look, all the Islamist groupings are actually opportunistic, but I also think that local groups are also opportunistic. I mean, if you take Al-Shabaab, and I spoke about the fact that you have one clan, the Rahan Wayne, which features very prominently. For the Rahan Wayne to be, they will not get much support inside Somalia saying we're Rahan Wayne. So they use political Islam as their vehicle. You know, instead of talking about your clan, which you talk about the Ummah.
Yeah.
Right? And you mobilize that way. And of course, Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, is, in terms of the church there, the identity of the Orthodox Church in terms of Ethiopian identity and so on, national identity. So now you're saying you're going to war against the Christian infidels, right? And you carry on the wars of 700 years ago, 200 years ago, and so on. And then, of course, in terms of the Americans and other European support for the Somali government and so on, well, you can go back to the 1920s and look at the fight against British colonial rule, for example, and they again make use of political Islam as a vehicle. So this opportunism, whether it is in terms of COVID, whether it is high food prices as a result of the war in terms of Ukraine, whether it is because of poor governance, whether it is because of Western support for governments which don't have their people's interests. They exploit all of this, but local groups also exploit it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for going through all of that. I think that's good for part one of our interview here with Dr. Hussein Solomon, and we look forward to hearing you next week on the Geopolitical Pickle to continue our talk.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to Geopolitical Pickle.
We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
In the meantime, follow us on Instagram for more behind-the-scenes content.
And subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast.
Thank you, and see you next week.